Hello everybody, I am Jmulls of Jmulls Gaming, and it's time for some hot, spicy takes for Final Fantasy XIV Dawntrail. I put out the hunt for hot takes, you delivered, so now I shall react to them. Bear in mind, this is just a video game. It's never that serious, it's never too deep, this is all meant in good fun, so let's get right on into it. Our first hot take comes in from @LillianBullH6465, who says the Scions should have all died and Endwalker and Dawntrail should have been a complete fresh cast, apart from the Warrior of Light. See, the way I view it is there's two ways they could have gone about when it comes to Dawntrail. Either you keep the Scions and you make them heavily important characters still, or you wholesale abandon them and you focus on developing new characters for this new age of the story. And the thing is, they kind of went half and half with it. Every now and then Scions may show up, but they are kind of written out of the story for the most part, like Y'shtola, like Sphene, and then the ones we have on screen, like Alize and Alphino, at least for the most part, largely barely even feel like themselves as characters, and they're largely just there to fulfill the trust quota for whatever dungeon or duty we're doing at that point in time. Personally, I'm kinda glad they didn't die in Endwalker, because I think killing all of those characters that we came to know and love all in one fell swoop, yeah, that scene would definitely have had notoriety, because it would have happened in Ultima Thule, 100%. But I don't know, I just kind of prefer having them around. They have interesting stories still to tell, like Y'shtola especially in my opinion. They just need to actually tell that story. But I think blue ballsing the entire player base when it comes to, hey, remember this character? Yeah, they're in the story, but we gotta sideline them for a little bit. I think that's kind of the worst of all possible worlds to pick for this. And when it's characters we all know and love, well, we don't exactly want to see them not even be bad, just mediocre in terms of storytelling enjoyment. Because Sphene had cool scenes, but he was like there for, what, 3 scenes at that? Personally, I would have preferred exploring Shaloni, the cowboy place, alongside Erenville with the Sphene. That could have been a really fun dynamic, but they just had him show up for a scene and then leave. It's this awkward middle place they found themselves in when it comes to Dawntrail, and I think it's the worst possible of the 3 routes. The next hot take comes in from @Zenado22. May not be the Ifrit level hot take you're looking for, but when I first started the game, the UI overwhelmed the hell out of me. They really need to make a streamlined option, at least for new players, because it almost turned me off from the game immediately. And I do know other people who completely stopped playing because it was too confusing. Luckily, I've gotten pretty used to it now. I'm in 2 minds about this because, one, I really like how the UI customization and the editing the UI elements are baked into the game naturally, and I don't require a separate add-on or anything like that. Having said that, there's certain elements, mainly tracking certain buffs and stuff like that, that I find to be really cumbersome in Final Fantasy XIV specifically. I'm all for additional options being added to games like this, and they have shown a propensity to actually implement streamlined UI elements, namely with the job action gauges. If you go into the UI editing interface, you can select the job gauge to be a simplified, streamlined version. I don't particularly know what else they would do to streamline the rest of the UI, outside of maybe the HP and MP bar, but I think it's a larger symptom of Final Fantasy XIV simply being a hotkey-based MMO, and the UI pretty much being busy because of that. There's a lot of information the player needs to be privy to, or at least have access to, and to be readily available in a non-cumbersome way, so it can make the UI at least look very busy. It's one of the advantages of having, say, add-ons for games. That culture doesn't exactly exist in Final Fantasy XIV, and I think for the most part, the game is for the better because of that, but having a more static UI is kind of a consequence of that decision. Now we get into a bit of a deep philosophical one. @Sh532 brings to the arena the ethical philosophical problems with the Warrior of Light being Tural's kingmaker for fun are huge and glossed over. We are way too strong to get involved just because we get asked. may not be indebted to Tural's defense, even potentially against Eorzea, because we're the reason they have Wuk-Lamat as their ruler, since she would have failed without us, and didn't actually have any real evidence Wuk-Lamat would be a good ruler / not betray us. There could be huge unintended consequences, and it's surprisingly amateurish / simplistic writing from a game that has previously shown an extremely strong grip on geopolitics and power struggles. I would personally point to Garlemald and Endwalker as a good example of that. But I also want to bring to the table one of the replies to that hot take. At The Wicked Wizard of Oz 1 replied, "The entire story misunderstands human nature. The Pelu Pelu wants everyone to be happy in every business deal, instead of the realistic approach to business that we see in the post-Stormblood Salt trading questline, Ul'dah Alamigo. Simply supporting a candidate because she asks us to is senseless when we have absolutely no context of the political situation in Tural. Either we knew plenty about Ishgard, Alamigo, Doma, and Garlemald before ever getting to any of these places. Why would we support a claimant we know nothing about? If we were to be brought in for the right of succession, it would have made more sense for Gulul Jar Jar to invite us and ask to mentor and evaluate his children. We would have been advisors to the Dawn Servant in an unofficial capacity, as that would fit with our historical stance of political neutrality, instead of hired muscle for one claimant to get her way." I largely agree, but I think the reason we ended up in this situation goes back to a point they made a couple of times, and I'm going to really hammer in on, and that is the simplistic writing. Simply put, it's kind of the writing style of Dawntrail, especially for the right of succession elements, to where it feels way more simplified and just character-driven instead of necessarily having realistic world building. Now, the right of succession absolutely has a lot of world building to it, but it's not really us reacting and trying to learn on our feet about these various places. It's essentially just a history lesson or a culture lesson for these people. It's a very minor difference, but it's a big important difference when it comes to what the story prioritizes. When it came to a place like Garlemald, we dealt with subject matters such as overt patriotism, the effects of propaganda across various generations, the effects of imperialism not only on those colonized but also on, like, the empire themselves and the citizenry, like Garlemald. We had that entire story with Quintus, with a grand, glorious dream we once shared, immediately followed by him getting isekai'd. It's a far more mature story that tackles more mature themes in a more coherent and realistic way. When it comes to Dawntrail, it's largely a shonen anime, at least in terms of execution. Characters are largely archetypical, and it's really supposed to be upbeat and happy-go-lucky for the most part. So really, the main extent of nuance and mature themes comes with the lizard people in Yaktel. But even then, the crimes and almost the vast amounts of baby killing they actually had there, whether it's direct or indirect, we kind of sweep that under the proverbial rug because it's just not that kind of story. And I think by itself, that would be okay. The problem is when you're coming off the backs of stories like Stormblood, Heavensward, Shadowbringers, Endwalker, and you're tackling these more mature themes that are very similar to what we just covered in Dawntrail, but arguably in a far better cohesive and realistic twist, well then it makes what came across in Dawntrail feel childish in comparison. The reason there isn't a massive ethical quandary when it comes to us supporting Wuk-Lamat, or Thancred and Urianger supporting Kona, is simply because it's a shonen anime and they are the protagonists. Like, it's okay because they're the good guys. I think that makes for a less engaging story, and it kind of goes into the larger issues and critiques that I have with Dawntrail on the whole, because it feels like such a stark contrast to everything that has come before. Think about all the world building we had for Doma before we ever stepped foot into Doma. Like, this went back all the way to the patches of A Realm Reborn with Ugiri and the refugees from Doma, us learning about the way they cook and all that. We had so much world building for them over the years, and it all culminated with us going there in Stormblood. Kind of the extent of what we had for the new world was the Blue Mage quests. And the whole pivot for us to go to Dawntrail to begin with was largely just 6.55. If we had significantly more development before Dawntrail in regards to Wuklamot, in regards to possibly Galul Jar Jar, and some of these characters and some of the politics and the geopolitics going on in the new world, then maybe it would make a decision like this land way better and feel more cohesive, especially in comparison to the way the story had been before in Final Fantasy XIV. I don't know, those are my 2 cents on it. Next hot take comes in from @TheDuckIsRonin. Sphene wasn't handled that badly as a villain. I don't even see her as a knockoff Meteion Emmet. I kinda do, but I also don't mind Sphene. I think she's a pretty okay villain. One, I'm a big fan of Final Fantasy IX, so the fact that all of the Alexandria elements had so much Final Fantasy IX stuff in it, I liked it because of that. But also, look, I'm not a fan of Wuklamot as a character either. She's arguably my least favorite or my most disliked character that Final Fantasy XIV has ever produced. However, I do like how Sphene acts as a contrast to Wuklamot's worldview. Wuklamot wants to ensure the peace for her people and wants to make sure that her people are happy. Sphene kind of shows how you can go too far over the edge with that, and in pursuit of that peace and happiness for your own people, you can end up being a villain to everybody else and not care about the consequences of your own actions to achieve your own quote-unquote selfish ambitions. Possibly there was a better way to execute on this, especially if I think Wuklamot was better written. However, I like the way that Sphene kind of tackled that idea. And sure, I think it's fair to say that Living Memory shares a lot of similarities in terms of narrative structure when it comes to, say, Ultima Thule, but I think the differences that exist are enough to make it fun and to make it nice. And while I don't care about it as much as I do Meteion and Emmet Selk, I think in a story that was largely not hooking me all that much as all the other expansions had, I think Sphene was kind of this glimmer of hope in that entire story for me. I think it doesn't help that we just went from expansions back to back with Shadowbringers with Emmet Selk and then Endwalker with Meteion, but also Emmet Selk and making him even better. Like, following that up is really hard. And in comparison, it can make a character that I think is solidly okay to even pretty dang good. It can make them look worse in comparison. But personally, I really like the whole Alexandria bit. There's certain elements that I'm not that big of a fan on, mainly the pacing, but I think on the whole, I think it's a pretty dang good story, with some really cool elements to it. Brought down by, say, Wuklamot and Zoraal Ja, but I think Sphene's one of the main highlights of it. So I guess I kind of agree with this hot take. Go figure. Our penultimate hot take comes in from Melanie B. Burger 2191, who says, instead of whining about difficult content, people should accept that it's okay to wipe, try to improve themselves, and get good. Personally, that's what I enjoy out of a game like Final Fantasy XIV. I like learning the fights, I like trying to get better at the game, learning my job, getting better at that, getting better at my role, utilizing the tools in my kit to overcome whatever challenge that the fight may try and pose to me. I really like those elements. Having said that, let's be honest here, we've all been there. There are some times in some groups where they're just people that wipe on things repeatedly and you just don't know how they don't know how to overcome it. It doesn't make sense to you, it doesn't compute, and you just wonder how they even dress themselves in the morning. We've all been there, we don't need to sugarcoat it. And continually wiping because of people like that can be pretty frustrating, especially when you yourself know that you know how to overcome these mechanics, you are doing all the right things, but you can't progress any further because of the people you're with, even if it's in a random group. However, I tend to find those cases to be fewer and farther between than most groups that I end up running into. Personally, I'm fine with the game trying to go harder and trying to become more of a challenge on a baseline level, because I think the larger issue is when you try and become too easy and try and streamline the game too much in regard to the content you are asked to overcome, then the bigger issue you run into is the lack of interesting things to do. Because I don't just think that the answer should be, well, if you want hard stuff, go play the endgame. Let me rephrase that. If you want fun stuff, go play the endgame. Just because something is easy doesn't mean that it can't be fun and engaging at the same time. But I think when you try and become too easy to make sure that everyone can get through it 100% of the time, then you are forced to streamline and focus in on repetitive things that everybody knows how to do at a basic level, or things can't be punishing enough to where you can just ignore them. I think on the whole it can make the game less interesting and less enjoyable. I think this can be especially shown when it comes to the dungeons found in Endwalker and now in Dawntrail. I found every dungeon that I've done in Dawntrail to be far more memorable, mechanically speaking, than any of the ones in Endwalker, except maybe the first one in Endwalker. I really like that one. Now, aesthetically, I love the ones in Endwalker, but mechanically speaking, I couldn't really tell you what most of them do, besides maybe the final boss of Vanispati, or just Vanispati on the whole. Look, I had to grind that one a lot. You obviously don't want the skill gap or the skill floor for the game on a basic level to go too high, because one, everyone has to be, or at least is expected to be able to clear the MSQ, but also you don't want your average, like, random queue to go wipe after wipe after wipe. Every now and then, sure, that can happen, but you don't want it to be every single time you hit the find dungeon button or find normal raid button, etc. Especially when we get to the Alliance raid soon. But I think being okay with the occasional wipe is something that should not be shunned and ignored. It should be something that is accepted. The Alliance raids of Stormblood were really fun because they were mechanically interesting, but also the mechanics mattered, because you knew it wasn't just going to be a simple walk in the park. At the end of the day, it's a video game, it has to be fun. And if you go on the line of being too easy, then you potentially compromise whatever mechanics could be there from being fun. At least to me. Okay, we have a final take, and this one's a spicy one. I saved arguably the hottest take for last, from @DanielNolan8848, who says it should have been Final Fantasy XVII. 14 should have gone out on the high note of Endwalker. This is the same mistake the 7 Remake series made. The old content is too long and 2 decades old to appeal to current gen. The game will only bleed out users before the old heads die out like World of Warcraft. Any effort gaining new players is so inefficient as to be wasted. Okay, let's start off rip that I disagree with this. There's an argument to be made, however, that the game should have ended with Endwalker because the code and the back-end stuff is notoriously bad, that it can be really hard to get even basic changes implemented into the game. That I can understand. However, one, they're never going to abandon Final Fantasy XIV when it's kind of the main thing keeping Square Enix afloat, at least from what I read in one PC Gamer article. It's like one of their main and only moneymakers. But also, I think Final Fantasy XIV at the end of the day is still a really good game that has a lot of great stories that it can still tell, that I don't think need wholesale revision in terms of making a new game. I think a lot of the issues that Final Fantasy XIV has right now, or at least the ones that could be fixed to make the game exponentially better, don't require a full back-end overhaul to the game, or even an entire new game overall. Things like job design, job identity, raising the difficulty at a base level a little bit further, though they largely remedied that with Dawntrail. I think instead of just going back from scratch and going back to the drawing board and creating an entire new game, and trying to get people invested in an entire new game world, there's still so much that can be done with 14 that I still want to see done. I still love Final Fantasy XIV as a game, mechanically speaking, and even story-wise. I really like the Arcadian, and I still think there's a lot of work that can be done in Final Fantasy XIV to make it even better in the future, and I'd rather them spend the time doing that than just trying to start from scratch all over again and first go back to pretty much the days of A Realm Reborn. And notice how they try to slide in 7 remakes slide in here, by the way. By the way, you may not know this about me, I love Final Fantasy VII, and I love the remake games, and I love Rebirth. Rebirth is actually on track to become my game of the year for 2024. I think the remake games had one big crippling flaw, and that was being PlayStation exclusives for the most part. Each game also has its own like little ancillary issues, like remake being far too linear because they're trying to replicate that feeling of being in Midgard that the old game had. But that was only a 5-hour segment of the game from back in the day compared to the 40-hour behemoth of a game we got with Remake. And then in Rebirth, there's a few mini games that are not fun and are just annoying and wildly outstay their welcome. But I think on the whole, Rebirth does an amazing job doing what Remake set out to do, but even better. I think the combat's better, enemy variety is better, boss design is better, the story's better, the character moments are even better, and I loved those elements from Remake. I think 7, more so than most of the other Final Fantasies, was a really good game by itself, but I've absolutely loved what they've done when it came to the Remake series, and expanding on, extrapolating on these key moments and fleshing them out and adding so much more to with them, because it doesn't compromise the original game that came before. And I think if you've been following the story for Remake and Rebirth, then the actual narrative that went on in those games isn't all that confusing, and isn't all that separate from the kind of themes that were tackled in 7 back in the day. Honestly, my only complaint with Remake and Rebirth is that the only more traditional retelling of the original FF7 that we've gotten at this point is a mobile gacha game, and I would love to see a proper remaster or more traditional remake of the original FF7 at some point. But I think 7, like 14, still has a bunch of story to be told that can be really interesting and not going to appeal to everybody, because people at the end of the day will have different tastes and different preferences, and that's okay. But these things greatly appeal to me, and while they may not like hit the ball every single time, for the most part they produce enjoyable experiences that I'm super glad to have played and enjoyed. Sometimes they can be deeply flawed, like Rebirth and Remake, and maybe sometimes they miss the mark for me, like Dawntrail and Final Fantasy XIV in terms of the story. But the highs are high enough and frequent enough to where I still overall enjoy the product. And with that, I'll call the video there for the day. Thank you all for tuning in. My pleasure for making the video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out and helps support future content, and I greatly appreciate it. And leave a comment down below with your own hot take for Final Fantasy XIV. Maybe I'll do another one of these videos if this video gets enough likes. We'll see. Remember, at the end of the day, this is all in good fun. I asked for these hot takes, so don't take anything too seriously. Just cut loose, have some fun. Life's too short to get bent out of shape about opinions online. Thank you all for tuning in. My pleasure making the video. Stay safe, have a great day. Leave a like and subscribe, and I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye, everybody. Until we meet again!